The small window of her stone chamber at Tordesillas cast thin rectangles of light across the floor, illuminating the dust particles that floated in the stale air. In this meager light, a woman of regal bearing sat motionless, staring at the coffin that accompanied her in captivity. For nearly 5 decades, Joanna of Castile would live as a prisoner, stripped of her crown, yet never her title, a queen in name, locked away by her father, her husband, and finally, her son. History would call her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, but the truth of her mind remained as confined as her body, entombed within the whispers of those who imprisoned her. Born in 1479 to the formidable Catholic monarchs Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, Joanna entered a world where women's power was carefully circumscribed by the men who ultimately controlled their destinies. The third child but second daughter, she was never expected to rule. Education befitting a Renaissance princess filled her early years. Latin, religious instruction, music, dance, all designed to prepare her for her true purpose, a strategic marriage to extend Spain's power across Europe. The girl who loved music and showed a quick, inquisitive mind was merely currency in the royal marriage market, her personal desires subordinate to dynastic ambitions. In 1496, at 16, Joanna was sent to Flanders to marry Philip the Handsome, son of Maximilian I, Holy Roman Emperor. The political calculations were clear. This union would forge an alliance against an increasingly powerful France and extend Habsburg Trastamara influence. What wasn't calculated was the devastating psychological impact this match would have on the young princess. Contemporary accounts describe Joanna's immediate and overwhelming attraction to her husband, a golden-haired, blue-eyed archetype of masculine beauty who, by all accounts, initially returned her affection with equal passion. Their relationship quickly transformed into something darker. Philip, raised in the licentious Burgundian court, had no intention of maintaining fidelity. His flagrant affairs drove Joanna to fits of jealousy that became the first whispers of her alleged madness. Yet through modern eyes, her reactions appear as those of a betrayed and manipulated young woman, isolated in a foreign court where her husband controlled every aspect of her existence. When Philip deliberately flirted with her ladies-in-waiting, when he publicly humiliated her, Joanna responded with rage, behavior deemed unacceptable for a royal woman expected to silently endure her husband's indiscretions. The cold stones of the Flemish palaces witnessed Joanna's deterioration as Philip weaponized her emotional responses. Each outburst became evidence of instability, each confrontation proof of irrationality. In letters home, Joanna pleaded for understanding, but distance made intervention impossible. Her mother Isabella, herself a powerful queen, offered sympathy but little practical support. The political alliance mattered more than her daughter's suffering. Fate intervened in ways no one anticipated. Death began systematically eliminating all who stood between Joanna and the Spanish throne. Her only brother Juan died in 1497. Her elder sister Isabella followed in 1498, then Isabella's infant son Miguel in 1500. Suddenly, improbably, Joanna became heir to Castile and Aragon, the most powerful kingdoms in the Iberian Peninsula. This twist of destiny transformed her marriage overnight. Philip was no longer merely consort to a Spanish infanta, but potential co-ruler of an empire. In 1504, Queen Isabella died, and Joanna legally became Queen of Castile. The stage was set for the final tragic act of her freedom. As her mother lay dying, Isabella had added a fateful clause to her will. If Joanna was unwilling or unable to govern, her father Ferdinand would rule as regent. This single phrase would become the legal justification for Joanna's imprisonment, a weapon wielded first by her father then by her husband, each man claiming she was mentally unfit to rule while they seized her power. The power struggle between Ferdinand and Philip over who would control Castile through Joanna became increasingly bitter. Both men circulated rumors of her instability while simultaneously claiming to protect her interests. In 1506, Philip and Joanna traveled to Spain to claim her inheritance. In a dark castle in Burgos, Philip suddenly fell ill with a fever and died within days. He was 28 years old. What followed has become the most infamous chapter of Joanna's story, the incident that seemingly confirmed her madness in the eyes of history. Refusing to part with Philip's body, she kept his coffin with her, occasionally opening it to gaze upon his decomposing remains. The funeral procession traveled only at night because Joanna irrationally feared other women might look upon her dead husband. Contemporary chroniclers described a queen driven mad by grief, wandering the Spanish countryside with a rotting corpse. Whatever her mental state, the aftermath sealed her fate. Ferdinand, returning from Naples, took control of Castile as regent for his unstable daughter. By 1509, Joanna was no longer merely supervised, but imprisoned at the Palace of Tordesillas, a confinement that would last for 47 years, until her death. The conditions were often brutal. Reports suggest she was sometimes kept in a room with no windows, denied basic comforts, and even physically abused by her keepers when she resisted their control. Ferdinand died in 1516, but freedom did not follow. Joanna's teenage son Charles, raised in Flanders with no memory of his mother, arrived in Spain to claim both her and his grandfather's thrones. Despite having never met the woman who gave him his royal blood, Charles continued her imprisonment, equally unwilling to risk her potential claim to power. Throughout Charles's reign, as the mighty Emperor Charles V, his mother remained the ghost in the locked room, the queen who never ruled. The psychological reality of Joanna's decades in captivity can only be imagined. Day after day, year after year, she lived in forced isolation, occasionally visited by nobles or relatives who reported varying accounts of her mental state. Some described a woman clearly disturbed, talking to invisible presences, refusing food, neglecting her appearance. Others encountered a lucid, intelligent queen who understood precisely how she had been betrayed by the men in her life. What is certain is that Joanna endured decades of what today would be considered psychological torture. Her children were taken from her, her royal prerogatives were exercised in her name by men who kept her locked away. Her only constant companion was her own isolation. In rare moments when visitors were permitted, she reportedly asked about affairs of state, revealing a mind still engaged with the world beyond her walls, despite everything done to crush her spirit. Joanna's final years at Tordesillas grew ever more constrained. As an elderly woman in her 70s, she found even her religious practices restricted. When she embraced certain Protestant ideas brought to her attention by sympathetic attendants, her son's representatives intervened, fearing political consequences if the imprisoned queen showed heretical leanings. Even her conscience belonged to others. On April 12, 1555, Joanna of Castile died at Tordesillas, having spent most of her 75 years as a captive. She was buried in the Royal Chapel of Granada beside Philip, reunited in death with the husband whose treatment had begun her downfall. Her son Charles, the emperor on whose dominions the sun never set, ordered appropriate royal ceremonies for the mother he had kept imprisoned all his adult life. The cold stone tombs of Granada contain a different truth than the official histories. Beneath the marble effigies lies a woman who legally held the throne of Spain's greatest empire, yet never truly reigned. A queen whose power was so feared that 3 generations of men conspired to lock her away. A mind labeled mad because madness was the only acceptable explanation for a woman who refused to quietly accept her place. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Joanna's story is not what we know, but what remains unanswerable. In the long, silent hours of her captivity, what thoughts filled her mind? Did she come to believe the madness attributed to her, or did she maintain an inner clarity that made her imprisonment all the more torturous? Did she find solace in the faith that dominated her era, or did her religious explorations represent a final attempt to claim some freedom of thought in a life where all other freedoms had been denied? The stone walls of Tordesillas have crumbled to ruins, but they still guard their secrets. 5 centuries later, the true Joanna remains as imprisoned in historical narrative as she once was in her physical cell, waiting for a liberation that never came, while the crown that sat unused upon her head cast shadows longer and darker than any dynasty could have imagined.